The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address the cover-up budget. Now, of course, the Liberal government is heading into an election. I hear applause from across the way, but I'm not sure they'll be applauding after they get the verdict of the people. A verdict is an appropriate term, though, because, of course, we're dealing with a very serious set of allegations and apparent corruption emanating from the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Now, I call it the cover-up budget because the government has decided to use the old Kathleen Wynne three-step. Step 1, massive scandal. Step 2, massive deficit spending to distract from it. And step 3, massive tax increases after the election to pay for it all. Now, we know that the Kathleen Wynne three-step was designed by none other than Gerald Butts, the former PMO puppet master who recently resigned in disgrace over the SNC-Lavalin scandal. And going into this budget, the government was obviously overtaken by the public frenzy around revelations that the Prime Minister interfered in a criminal trial to help a Liberal-linked company get off charges. And so they splashed $41 billion of cash, new spending, around in order to distract from it all. Now, they'll be quick to point out that $41 billion is just if you use cash accounting. Well, we can use accrual accounting and it works out to $23 billion, but the bottom line is this. The Prime Minister has broken his promise of balancing the budget this year. He is planning, in fact, to add even more to the national deficit next year. And all of this is part of a scheme to spray billions of dollars at Canadian voters to distract them from the scandal before the election and then raise their taxes to pay for it after the election. In order to understand the cover-up budget, you need to understand the scandal that it attempts to hide. And let me turn my attention now to that. Before I do, though, I will point out that we're returning full circle, because this scandal started with the last budget. The government introduced Budget 2018, which made vague reference to addressing corporate crime. It seemed to be rather benign, possibly even something that all parties could support. Everyone is against corporate crime, after all, or so we thought. And then, when we were sitting in a Finance Committee meeting, nearing midnight, going through the nearly 500 pages of omnibus budget legislation that flowed out of the 2018 budget, we stumbled on something that surprised us. It was an amendment to the criminal code. And everyone in the room was shocked, including Liberals. The Liberal member for Hull-Elmer looked at it. He said, it doesn't smell right. He said, it looks like we're giving a slap on the wrist to large-scale corporate criminals. If I could paraphrase a colorful quote, he said, if I steal $10, I'm fine, but if I steal $10, I'm in trouble. But if I steal 10 million, I get off just fine. That was the impression he got from amendments that the finance minister introduced to the criminal code in his budget. The chairman of the committee, a lifelong Liberal, a devoted partisan, said, and it's on the record, that he thought it was inappropriate that such an amendment to the criminal code would find its way into a budget bill. That we would discuss changes to criminal penalties in the Finance Committee rather than in the Justice Committee, where the criminal code is normally debated and addressed. Now, throughout all this debate, the question mark that kept appearing in everybody's mind was, who's asking for this? Why are they trying to amend the budget? Why are they trying to amend the criminal code in the budget? Who is behind this change? Because obviously somebody must want it, or the government wouldn't have gone through so much trouble to draft such an amendment. And we would find out later on exactly who was driving this change, and it was SNC-Lavalin. A story appeared in February in the Globe and Mail saying that the Prime Minister and his team had personally and politically interfered with the then former Attorney General in order to get her to extend a special deal to SNC-Lavalin that would shelve the charges of fraud and bribery in order to allow the company to go on with business as usual. Now, the budget 2018 had made that possible. It had created something called deferred prosecution agreements. Essentially, these agreements allow the company to avoid trial, prosecution, and even conviction if they fess up, apologize, pay a fine, and promise not to do it again. Now, of course, if a homeless guy is charged with stealing a loaf of bread, he has no similar approach he could take. He can't simply knock on the Prime Minister's door and say, would you mind calling the Attorney General, who will call a Crown attorney and agree to set aside the charges as long as I give back the bread and promise not to steal it again. That doesn't exist for other people. That's right. But this Liberal government has created this special deal available to powerful corporate criminals in cases apparently like this one. Now, the amendment to the Criminal Code gave very specific criteria against which any corporations desired to have such a deal must be judged. Canada's top prosecutor, known as the Director of Public Prosecutions, considered SNC-Lavalin's request for such a deal against the criteria in the Criminal Code and the facts of the case. And she concluded that SNC-Lavalin did not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement. Some of the factors she would have considered are these. Did the company voluntarily tell authorities of its crimes? Of course, the answer was no. The company got caught when one of its officials was charged in Switzerland and ultimately found guilty of crimes in that country. That was what led authorities in Canada to learn that the crime had happened, not a voluntary disclosure from corporate executives to the Canadian government. Secondly, the severity of the offense. Well, was this a minor offense, an oversight, a small failing that could be treated with a minor penalty? Of course, the answer to that is no. And let me turn my attention now to that particular issue. Because there has been this racist undertone to the story, where people have said, you know, sure, SNC-Lavalin might have bought prostitutes and other gifts for the Gaddafis. Sure, the Gaddafis got free yachts, but that's just the way things are done in those countries over there. And so we should just understand that if Canadian businesses are going to do commerce abroad, that this is the kind of muck they're going to have to get into. So goes the argument. Well, let me say, first of all, that this case is not just about the sordid examples of bribery, as disgusting as those are. It is also about fraud, which is the other allegation the company faces in Canadian courts in this particular matter. Fraud of the Libyan people in amounts totaling $130 million. I don't know about you, Madam Chair, but I think that stealing from poor people is a pretty miserable way to make money. And I don't think our justice system should treat such crimes as minor affairs because, and I'm quoting, that's just the way things are done over there. The reason so many of these countries are so poor is precisely because of such parasitical corruption that drains the national wealth, that empties the pockets of tax-paying citizens in those countries without giving them anything back in return, that forces them to pay every time they want to go about their business and live their daily lives, and which creates a massive imbalance of power in favor of those who have money to pay bribes and against those who don't. So to those people who say that's just the way things are done over there, we should never accept that that's the way things are done. And that is why we signed on to international conventions against fraud and corruption, because we wanted to put an end to those practices so that the people in countries like Libya could turn their destinies around and build prosperous societies based on the honest and legal flow of commerce. As long as wealthy Western corporations believe they can go with impunity into poor countries and bribe the leaders to steal from the people, then those people will always live in poverty. And that poverty will be partly our fault if we are complicit in it or if we fail to punish those who carry it out. And the reason we have international conventions is because the traditional practice of many corporations was to go in, pillage and plunder, and then leave before local authorities could prosecute them, going back to Western countries where they continued to operate with impunity. In other words, if companies like SNC are not prosecuted over here, they will continue to carry out the alleged crimes that we witness in this case over and over and over again. And countless people in the poorest countries in the world will forever pay the price. We, as conservatives, do not accept that that's the way business is done, and we will ensure that while Canadian businesses should have the legitimate right to do well by doing good, to trade with the world, to grow and prosper, that they shall never make a buck by stealing from the world's poor. Yeah. And so let me go into the specifics of the allegations of fraud and bribery that SNC faces in Canadian courts today. The specifics of the case that the Prime Minister tried to set aside by pressuring his Attorney General to sign a special deal with that company. And let me go through it. In 2015, the RCMP charged SNC-Lavalin, along with its international division, with corruption and fraud in relation with their business dealings in Libya. The RCMP said officials at the company attempted to bribe several public officials in the country, including dictator Muammar Gaddafi, as well as other businesses in Libya. RCMP officials said, I'm quoting from Global News now, RCMP officials said SNC-Lavalin also lied to Libyan companies to defraud them of nearly $130 million. Now, Financial Post, SNC and its subsidiaries, SNC-Lavalin Construction, Inc. and SNC-Lavalin International, are also alleged to have defrauded various Libyan public agencies of approximately $129.8 million. Now I'm quoting further from the Financial Post. According to police, Ben Issa established a scheme in which two companies, Duvel Securities and Dinova International, billed SNC roughly $127 million for helping the firm win dozens of major contracts in Libya during the 2000s. In fact, Swiss and Canadian police say Duvel and Dinova were shell companies controlled by Ben Issa. The money, including $1.5 million spent on a yacht for Saadi Gaddafi was used to bribe Libyan officials and pad the bank accounts of Ben Issa and Mr. Bedbawi, who left SNC in 2006. In September, now I'm quoting Global News again, in Switzerland, an ex-senior employee from SNC-Lavalin pleaded guilty to fraud, corruption, and money laundering in relation to his business in Libya in 2014, before the RCMP charges. Riyad Ben Issa acknowledged in court that he bribed Saadi Gaddafi, son of Libya's late dictator Muammar Gaddafi, so SNC could win contracts. Now, to quote the National Post, receipts gathered during an investigation of a former SNC-Lavalin executive show $30,000 in payments to Saadi Gaddafi for sexual services in Canada. Transactions they wrote in as companion services, quoting, in their expense reports, these companion services cost between $600 and $7,500 each. Close to $10,000 in services went to a single escort service in Vancouver. Other payments went to a Montreal strip club and covered events at the Air Canada Centre in Toronto, such as box seats for a Spice Girls concert. Now, it's very easy to dismiss some of this salacious bribery as just part of a broader soap opera. These obviously, the participants in this this behavior might be morally corrupt themselves, but at the end of the day, some will say, what is the overall problem that we're trying to address? And I bring your attention back to the earlier excerpts that I read, and I'm going to read it again. The reason for all of this bribery was so that SNC could defraud various Libyan public agencies of $130 million. So in other words, they delighted the pleasures of top Gaddafi family members as a means to an end. And the end, of course, was to steal $130 million from some of the poorest people in the world. So, let us all agree, never again to refer to these alleged crimes as victimless crimes. That's right. They are not victimless crimes. There are people living in squalor in other parts of the world because crimes like this take place. I list all of that chronology in order to address the criteria in the deferred prosecutions section of the Criminal Code, which says that such agreements will be available only when the severity of the crime is limited. In other words, if it's not a serious crime, if it was a mistake with limited consequences and minimal damage to any victims, the government is then entitled to enter into a negotiation with an accused corporate criminal in order to resolve it through a deferred public prosecution agreement. Based on what I have just read to you, Madam Speaker, I think you will agree that this was not a small, petty crime. This was a serious and egregious and systematically executed crime carried out against the Libyan people. And therefore, on that basis, SNC did not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement if you were reading the Act as it is written. The next section in the criteria in the Act that determines whether the top prosecutor should enter into negotiations with an alleged corporate criminal for a deferred prosecution agreement asks the prosecutor to consider whether this was an isolated incident. So I ask you, Madam Chair, was this behavior by SNC-Lavalin an isolated affair, or was it part of a pattern of behavior? Was it just a few rotten apples in a faraway land who did some dirty dealings and have no link back to Canada? Well, obviously, the answer is no. While these charges I'm about to read off have nothing to do with the deferred prosecution agreement the Prime Minister sought, they do speak to the criminal code's criteria on whether or not the company has a systematic history of corruption or whether this was an isolated case. Again, I read from Global News. 3 top executives were also charged with bribery in relation to the McGill University Health Centre. Former CEO Pierre Poilievre, along with McGill officials, pleaded guilty in the case. Funny, Madam Speaker, a company that tries to rob people in faraway lands might just do the same back here at home. In other words, those people who comfort themselves by saying, sure, they're ripping off other people, but that doesn't cost us any money, better actually check the facts. Because from a rotten tree comes nothing but rotten fruit. And we have paid the price here in Canada for that corruption, as evidenced by the guilty plea of the company's former CEO, not a junior intern who stole a candy bar. This is the top official in the entire company. Let me now read again from Global News. Quebec prosecutors are working with the RCMP on the possibility of new criminal charges against SNC-Lavalin tied to a contract to refurbish Montreal's Jacques Cartier Bridge, court documents show. And there we have it again. More corruption involving major Canadian infrastructure projects. Now, of course, the state of our dilapidated bridges in many parts of this country is well known. In Montreal, it is especially the case. And to think that the people of Quebec and Montreal suffer the consequences when corruption by companies like this descends upon major projects that affect their daily commute demonstrates that corruption does not come without a cost. I read further from Global News. In court documents, the RCMP lays out a bribery scheme involving a $127 million Jacques Cartier Bridge contract in the early 2000s. Former federal officials, Michel Fournier, pleaded guilty in 2017, just 2 years ago, to accepting more than $2.3 million in payments from SNC-Lavalin in connection with the project. So, again, Madam Speaker, we see that this corruption does not have borders, that we are not immune from the effects of a company that decides it's going to buy its way to public contracts rather than earning those contracts on merit. Further, I quote again from Global News. In 2011, an SNC employee whose job was to facilitate travel of SNC employees in and out of Libya was arrested in Mexico and accused of attempting to smuggle Gaddafi's son and family out of the country. The employee was eventually released from jail and not charged in Canada. Again from Global News. The company was also banned from bidding on projects by the World Bank for 10 years over alleged misconduct during a bridge construction contract in Panama. Now we're in Panama, right? We've gone from Libya to Montreal and now to Panama. During an investigation, this is again from the Global News, during an investigation from CBC and the Globe and Mail, it was alleged there was an internal accounting code for bribes. All right, so again, remember I said one of the criteria for getting access to a deferred prosecution agreement is that the alleged corporate criminal had no other track record of corruption, that the alleged incident was an isolated one, that it was completely out of character. Now, all of us agree that the justice system should take that into consideration as a mitigating factor. We all know stories of a youngster who makes a one-time mistake that's completely out of character, and the justice system looks at the person and says, this is not who that person is. We will administer a punishment, therefore, that allows for very quick restoration of that person as a member of society. That's why we have proportionality in the system, and that's why the deferred prosecution agreements are supposed to be judged on the basis of whether the company in question it may have engaged in an isolated incident or whether or not it was systematically part of the company's overall character, and that excerpt right there answers the question. Not only were they engaging in bribery, they had developed an internal accounting code. Imagine the trouble you have to go through, the participation you have to have from various members of the accounting system in order to develop a whole code. So it's not just corrupt activity, it's then corrupt coding in order to process that activity. A code would be a system, and system is the root of systematic. This is systematic corruption. And any government that would attempt to give a systematically corrupt company the ability to avoid prosecution has to answer for its own ethics in the process. And it's interesting that this attempt was made by the government across the way, because they know something about S&C's corruption. They participated in it. According to the Commissioner of Canada Elections, SNC-Lavalin gave approximately $100,000 of illegal donations to the Liberal Party. The commissioner, for reasons that are unknown to me, I still can't understand, decided not to pursue the allegations through a full criminal conviction, but instead signed an agreement called basically it's a compliance agreement. And in that agreement, the company admits not only that it flowed $100,000 to the Liberal Party, but that it did so in a manner that was absolutely systematic, almost on an industrial scale. They were having employees manufacture phony expense claims, and they were giving out phony bonuses and then communicating to their employees that they had to then take the money that they were receiving fallaciously and hand it over to the Liberal Party in the form of $100,000 of donations. We all know the donation limits are about, at the time, were about $1,200. So in other words, no person could give more than about $1,200 per year, and no company could give any donation at all. Unions and corporations are banned. So these executives said, we're going to create a bunch of phony bonuses and a bunch of phony expense claims with phony receipts, and then we're going to flow the money, says the SNC chair executives, flow that money to the Liberal Party. That is systematic, premeditated, carefully planned out corruption. And of course, once again, with this Liberal government in power, there was no prosecution of the offense. It was simply signed off by the election commissioner as a compliance agreement. The money was returned, and they were allowed to go on without any consequence. It seems wherever SNC and the Liberals interact, there's a special deal. You know, now here at the City of Ottawa, the company has been given the contract to extend the transit system out to the south end of town, a project I strongly support, for which I champion. The company didn't apparently meet the technical requirements that are necessary, even though some of the competitors did, but somehow the company got the contract anyway. But my point in raising all of these examples, Madam Chair, is to demonstrate that contrary to the requirement of the deferred prosecution agreements, that they should only be made available to companies for whom the alleged offense is an isolated incident. SNC-Lavalin has shown a period of systematic and repetitive acts of corruption, most of those acts related to fraud and bribery. In other words, the Director of Public Prosecutions was absolutely right to refuse this company such an agreement. But that wasn't good enough for the Prime Minister. He thought to himself, look, he introduced an amendment to the criminal code through his omnibus budget specifically so that he could help SNC-Lavalin. This company had lobbyists swarming all over Parliament Hill. It had made direct contact with top officials in the government. The chairman of SNC-Lavalin, Kevin Lynch, a former clerk, called the present-day clerk. There were dozens of registered lobbying interactions between top company officials or other lobbyists and high-level members of the Liberal government. So the Prime Minister was saying he was going to get it done one way or the other for this company. And when he learned, presumably in early September, that the company had that the top prosecutor had informed the company that it would not be availed such a special deal, he then thought, well, that's not a problem. We'll just call the Attorney General and she'll just overturn the prosecutor. There'll be a deal for SNC-Lavalin and we'll get back to business as usual. And that was the plan. And, you know, in fairness, that is how things have worked for SNC for a very long time. And the Prime Minister, I guess, had every reason to think that that would work. But then he encountered a problem that he didn't expect to find in his own cabinet. A person with principle. Someone who understood the law and viewed it as her job to respect the law. The Prime Minister assumed that if he made clear to her the political imperative, that she would find a way to cast the law aside and overturn the top prosecutor in the land to offer a special deal to SNC-Lavalin in its $130 million fraud and bribery case. She said no. She looked at the act. She said, clearly, this company does not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement. Furthermore, it would be literally unprecedented for an Attorney General to overturn a decision of the independent prosecutor. I'm not doing it, she said. Well, she thought that would be the end of the story. And ultimately, it should have been. The government should have said, well, we have here a very qualified Attorney General who has experience as a prosecutor and a meticulous understanding of the law. She has looked at the act and concluded that the top prosecutor was right and that the company doesn't deserve a deal. I'm sorry, that's where the story for the political actors ends and where the independent judicial process carries on. Now, before I go any further, for listeners out there who might not be aware of how strict is the separation between politics and courts, let me just say, let me give you a few examples. Former Quebec Premier Jean Charest was a member of this House and a minister in the Mulroney government. He very innocently called a judge one day about a case. There was no corrupt intent. He simply called because he thought he was advancing the public interest. And you know what happened to him? Resign. You're done. In previous Conservative government, Minister John Duncan received some input from a constituent about a case that was before a quasi-judicial board. He had no personal interest in it, and the constituent was just raising a legitimate grievance about how he had been treated in the process. And as an MP, he thought he'd call up the quasi-judicial board just make an intervention to help his constituent. Again, pure motives, legitimate desire to help a fellow Canadian, nothing whatsoever untoward or corrupt. And what happened to him? Resign. Why? Because we in this country accept a strict division between judicial bodies and political bodies. Absolutely strict. So strict that everything we say here in this House of Commons is exempt from being admitted against the people who spoke it in a court of law. And the principle, of course, is that just as politicians don't interfere in the courtroom, judges don't interfere in the House of Commons. There is a strict separation. I give that as background so that when we describe, as I am about to do, the relentless effort by the Prime Minister and his team to interfere with a criminal court proceeding, I want everyone to be aware just how rare and inappropriate it is. If it is a resigning offense for a minister in the previous government to call a quasi-judicial body about a constituent's concern, surely it's a resigning offense for the Prime Minister of Canada to carry out a consistent and sustained campaign of interference with his Attorney General to stop a $130 million fraud and bribery case from going ahead.
That's right. That's right.
But that's exactly what he did. And, you know, before let me just say that I'm going to relay the story of his interference, not from the vantage point of a conservative or a New Democrat, not from the vantage point of an angry anti-liberal journalist, if there is such a thing, but from the vantage point of liberals themselves. Remember, all of the allegations in this scandal come from the Prime Minister's own cabinet.
Right.
This is what makes the scandal so exceptional. Normally, governments are criticized or accused of things by members of the opposition or the media. In this case, the allegations all come from people the Prime Minister thought enough of to put them in charge of major government departments. So what did these people say? Well, the former Attorney General, someone in whom the Prime Minister entrusted the top law office of the land and eventually entrusted the care of our veterans, said that the Prime Minister and his team carried out sustained and consistent interference, that she experienced veiled threats, that she was hounded, that the entire campaign reminded her of, quote, the Saturday Night Massacre, a reference to Richard Nixon's mass firings in the Watergate scandal. Again, to the Liberal MPs rolling their eyes on the other side of the House, these are not hyperbolic allegations from the official opposition. They are words from the Liberals' own former Attorney General. Now, of course, she couldn't possibly be believed, said the Prime Minister. His ministers have his senior team have lined up to undermine her credibility and suggest that she was just angry because she lost her dream job, as Gerald Butts called it. Only problem, kind of a big problem, she kept records. She kept records of what happened. She kept notes. She kept texts. She kept other contemporaneous documents. And, of course, she has audio tapes to prove it all. Now, why would she have done that? Why would she have recorded a conversation with the Prime Minister's top public servant on this matter? Why? I'll tell you why. Because September, October, November, she had been hounded.
Fortunately, I do have a point of order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader has a point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I suspect if you were to go over the last half hour or so of discussion or from debate from the member opposite, you'll find that we've been very patient in trying to get a good understanding. Today's debate is all about Budget 2019, and all I would ask is that the member opposite at least every so often use the word budget, so this way people that are watching are aware that it is a budget debate.
I appreciate the information or the point of order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary is well aware that there is some latitude when there are debates in the House, and I am sure that the Honourable Member from Carleton will relook at his speech to make sure that he is actually addressing the budget bill, and I will send the time back to the Honourable Member for Carleton.
That was a strange intervention from the Deputy House Leader of the Liberal Party, Madam Speaker. He's now claiming that deferred prosecution agreements have nothing to do with budget policy. Well, that's funny. Well, why on God's green earth did they put it in the budget? Yeah. No, they put it in the budget. So now they have suggested that it is a budget matter. And therefore, we are left with nothing more than to debate it within the context of the budget. And it's funny, this is the second time members of the government have become confused by what they put in their own budget. I recently was at the Finance Committee, and I asked questions about deferred prosecution agreements to finance officials. I wanted to know why the finance minister was meeting with top executives and lobbyists from SNC-Lavalin in the weeks following the Director of Public Prosecution's decision not to extend a DPA to the company. And all of a sudden, the chair of the Finance Committee slammed down his gavel, and he said, "This is not relevant. It has nothing to do with finance." And I said to him, well, that's funny, because the deferred prosecution agreements were amended into the criminal code through legislation in the budget that was passed by the Finance Committee. Right. So this government used an omnibus budget bill to introduce this package of special deals for corporate criminals, and that's exactly why we are debating it today when the budget is before the House of Commons. Now, let me return to this issue of the audio tape, because the employment minister came out over the weekend and said it was unethical for her former cabinet colleague, the former Attorney General, to tape record a conversation with the clerk of the Privy Council. And as the Attorney General wrote herself in documents released Friday, it would otherwise have been inappropriate, but for the extraordinary circumstances with which she was faced. She had been mercilessly hounded in September, October, November, and almost all of December, when she got a call from the top public servant, and she knew it was trouble. She knew exactly what was going to happen on that call, because she and her staff had seen it again and again and again, 20 different times, which she has documented and proven occurred. Members of the Prime Minister's inner circle, plus the Prime Minister himself, had interfered with this case. And she knew, based on all of their duplicity and the dishonesty with which they were again and again approaching her, that if she didn't have evidence of what happened, they would lie and deny. And that is, she was absolutely right, because that is exactly what they have since done. The problem is they picked with the wrong person. They didn't realize she would keep evidence. They assumed that Canadians would never know the truth, that they would just deny her accounts and everyone would say, well, he said, she said, who knows, let's just throw up our hands and move on. Well, that's not possible when someone is as punctilious and specific as the former Attorney General. So let us consider some of the contradictions that have now been exposed since the release of her documentation. First of all, the Prime Minister, when the story broke on the front page of the Globe and Mail in February that the Prime Minister and his team had pressured the Attorney General to force her to offer the company a deferred prosecution agreement, the Prime Minister's response was that the story was false, strictly false. That's it. That's all. They would go on to make specific denials in the 48 to 72 hours that followed, saying that that the Prime Minister's team neither interfered nor pressured the Attorney General in the case. Well, that story didn't last long, did it? Because then later on, Prime Minister's clerk was forced to go before a committee where he admitted that there was pressure. He said, okay, so there was pressure. But pressure's normal, it's a high-pressure job. But that, of course, contradicts the very specific denial that the Prime Minister and his team had uttered. So there was the first change of story. Then, the Prime Minister famously went out and he said, if anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward. And no one did. And no one did. He left the impression that the Attorney General had just suddenly concocted a problem after she had moved out of the position of Attorney General. That, she woke up one day in February and decided she was upset with something that had happened months earlier, and nobody told the Prime Minister. He'd never heard anything about it. None of his team had heard a thing. Well, it turns out the Prime Minister was uttering a straight-up falsehood. There are other words that are unparliamentary that would describe that utterance, because the evidence is clear that she did, time and time again, warn the Prime Minister and his team that their behavior and their interference was inappropriate. In a September 18th meeting with the Prime Minister and the clerk, she said, she reports that she said, I looked him in the eye. And that's a quote. I looked him in the eye and asked, are you interfering with my work as Attorney General? At which he backed off and said, oh no, of course not. She said, good, I strongly advise against it. She said that to his face. And yet, he would go in front of all Canadians, 37 million Canadians, and deny that she had ever raised any concern at all. And if you don't believe her story, which she documented and put on the public record in the Justice Committee, something the Prime Minister has not had the courage to do himself, then you only need to listen to the audio conversation between the current Attorney General, the former Attorney General, and the Clerk of the Privy Council, in which at least a half a dozen times she uttered terms like, I feel very uncomfortable. This is very inappropriate. I can't believe we're even having this conversation. Over a half dozen times in that 17-minute conversation, she stated very clearly that what was happening was inappropriate, that the pressure campaign had to stop. She not only cited the conversation that she was engaged in at the moment with the clerk as an example, she also spoke to the clerk about Gerald Butts and Katie Telford's visit to her chief of staff and the pressure they applied. If you count it conservatively, as I'm fond of doing, this was over a half dozen times in this conversation that the former Attorney General raised the alarm bell to the Prime Minister's top public servant. And you know what he said? I've got a conversation coming with the Prime Minister. He's not going to be happy to hear this. Very clear in Michael Murdoch was that he was going to get off the phone with her and get on the phone with the Prime Minister. And this weekend we heard from the Prime Minister that he didn't know anything about that conversation. That his top public servant would have a conversation like that with his Attorney General about an issue that everyone in the government says the Prime Minister was very focused on. In the terms of the given by the clerk himself, the Prime Minister was firm on the issue. He's in a mood on the issue. So this was an issue very important to him. He apparently knew that the clerk was calling the Attorney General about it, but after the call happened, everyone just forgot to report to the Prime Minister or to his staff that it occurred, and what had been said in that conversation was just evaporated into thin air. And a month would go by, 2 months would go by, and the Prime Minister would never learn of all the things that we heard in that recording, not until she relayed them in a parliamentary committee months later. Give me a break, Madam Speaker. Exactly. Nobody believes the Prime Minister was blind to what went on in that conversation. And his attempts to say he was will only be met with the derision of millions of Canadians who know better. It is utterly impossible to imagine he would not have known. But even if you want to imagine it, even if you believe somehow the clerk forgot to mention it to the Prime Minister, there is more evidence that the Prime Minister knew of her concerns. But before I move on to that evidence, I just want to say there's been a new explanation out about why the clerk apparently didn't tell the Prime Minister about the call. And that explanation is that everyone went on vacation. So he did the phone call with the Attorney General, in which he said, basically implored her to help the company get a deferred prosecution agreement so that it wouldn't face trial for its $100+ million of fraud and bribery. And then she said, she pushed back hard, said it's inappropriate, I feel very uncomfortable, this reminds me of the Saturday Night Massacre. This explosive conversation happens. And what do you do after a talk like that? Oh, you're so exhausted, you go on vacation. And so everyone just up and left for Christmas. But the problem is they didn't. Now we have public records that the Prime Minister's vacation didn't start for another 48 hours. Now, the clerk and the Prime Minister speak daily, sometimes hourly, and of course it would have been very easy for him to report the conversation. Furthermore, whatever vacation the Prime Minister had, it wouldn't have lasted longer than a week or two, in which case he would have known about it in January, well before the cabinet shuffle.
Just ridiculous.
So, and then finally, we have the testimony from the clerk before the Justice Committee that this Prime Minister can be reached 24/7.
Through the switchboard.
Through the switchboard. Pick up the phone. Anybody's ever called the Prime Minister's switchboard, it's an interesting experience. You just call up and ask for anyone in the world you want. They put you on hold for about 30 seconds and you got them. It's a pretty impressive system of communication they have. But somehow it didn't work in the Prime Minister's office for the month following this extraordinary interaction. He just couldn't get a hold of the Prime Minister. You know, one day he's surfing in Tofino, then the next day, he's doing something else. It's just absolutely impossible for the clerk to relay this extraordinary conversation about an issue that was extremely pressing. That is what we are being expected to believe now. And that is an example of a contradiction to which we need clarity. And I'm standing and speaking at great length, much to the dismay and torment of my Liberal colleagues across the way. And I am here to say that I will merciful, I will put an end to this merciless address as long as they agree that all the witnesses all of the players who interfered with the Attorney General will come before a parliamentary committee and answer for their actions so that we can get to the bottom of this scandal. I will, at any moment, welcome the House Leader or the Deputy House Leader to rise to their feet and announce the cover-up is over, that the Prime Minister has agreed, all the witnesses in his office, in other ministerial offices, and the Prime Minister himself will all come before a parliamentary committee and testify under oath about what happened in this scandal. If they do that, then I will grant the mercy of ending this speech and allowing them to go back to bragging about their deficit spending and their tax increases. They can do it all day long, every day, until October, when voters will render a swift verdict against those policies as well. But the facts remain that there are enormous and glaring contradictions between the Prime Minister's personal utterances and the now publicly available evidence to the contrary. Evidence that the Prime Minister would like us to ignore and sweep under the table, that he would like to bury under tens of billions of dollars of borrowed money that he has piled into this pre-election budget. Our answer to him is no, we're not going to allow you to bury the truth. We are going to stand here and we are going to speak up and we are going to use every tool in the parliamentary toolkit to end the Prime Minister's cover-up and get to the truth. Now, for a moment, I'd like to comment on the methodology of the cover-up itself. We've talked about the apparent crime. Now let's talk about the cover-up. This government came forward with a massive new deficit spending budget. It is a promise-breaking deficit. Now, the Prime Minister promised during the last election he'd have 3 tiny deficits never to exceed $10 billion, followed by a balanced budget in the year 2019. In fact, as he put it, the budget will balance itself. And that was supposed to happen in the here and now. Instead, we've had deficits that have already totaled $60 billion, 3 times the total he promised. And the budget deficit this year is $20 billion more. Again, in a year in which there was supposed to be no deficit. Now, in this pre-election budget, in order to distract from the Prime Minister's SNC-Lavalin scandal, he added $41 billion in new cash spending, basically taking a fire hose and spraying cash in all directions in the hopes that grateful Canadian voters would be distracted from his personal conduct and vote for him in spite of all that he's done. But Canadians know that spending to distract from a scandal before an election is always followed by higher taxes after the election. And that is exactly what is happening in this case. This is, as I said earlier, the Kathleen Wynne 3-step. Massive scandal, massive spending to distract from that scandal, and massive tax increases to pay for it all after the election is over. Now, what evidence do we have of the Liberals' intention to raise taxes after the election? Well, let's start with the first and most obvious piece. They've already done it once. Best indication of future behavior is past behavior. This government came into office promising it would never raise taxes on the middle class, and then they went ahead and did exactly that. They took away the children's fitness tax credit, the public transit tax credit, income splitting, which made life a little fairer for families with a single income or where one spouse earned more than another. They raised the CPP premiums. They even targeted small businesses with specific tax increases going to small family-owned operations. Those tax increases penalized companies that share the earnings and work with family members, or that save within the company itself. All of those tax increases have happened already. According to a non-partisan, impartial study by the Fraser Institute, the average middle-class family is paying $800 more in income taxes than when this government first took office. And that does not even include increases to payroll taxes or the carbon tax, which just took effect in Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan today. So these tax increases already exist, and Canadians know that if a government is going to raise their tax once, it will raise their taxes again. And they tried. They tried other tax increases that we stopped through massive political pressure and public backlash. Let's go through the list of taxes they tried and failed to raise. They tried to take away the disability tax credit from diabetics and families with autistic children. That would have raised the taxes on those families by about $1,000. They backed off after we exposed them for doing it. They then tried to put in a new tax on health and dental benefits. Again, this tax increase was exposed through a series of media leaks showing that the Finance Department, under the leadership of this minister, was quietly doing the research and laying the groundwork to raise taxes on anyone who dares have a dental or supplementary health plan. But again, through relentless pressure from Her Majesty's loyal opposition and an uprising by Canadian workers who cherish their health benefits, they had to back down from that tax increase as well. They tried to impose a tax on passive income of small businesses of as high as 73%. They had to put that tax change on ice after a group of farmers, shopkeepers, and pizza shop owners rose up and fought back. They tried to put in a new tax they tried to double the tax on on small business owners who transfer their business from father to son or mother to daughter. This tax increase would have made the tax twice as high for a farmer transferring his farm to his son as if that farmer had transferred the farm to a foreign multinational corporation. And that would have ensured that within one generation, Madam Chair, our farmers would be tenants on their ancestral farmlands rather than owners of the land passed down from generation to generation. Thank goodness the government, under relentless pressure from this side of the House of Commons, put those tax increases on hold until after the election, when they no longer need voters but still need their money. Which brings us to the reason they need people's money. This finance minister has been growing spending at a rate of about 7% a year, 2.5 times the combined rate of inflation and population growth. When you grow spending faster than revenue over the long run, you end up raising taxes to pay for it. Sure, you can borrow in the short run to pay for it, but that makes the problem worse still, because not only do you have to pay for the spending into the future, then you have to pay for the interest on all of the growing debt. That interest is growing. 2 years ago, we paid $23 billion in annual federal debt interest. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, interest payments will rise to almost $40 billion over the next 5 years. In other words, we'll be spending as much on debt interest as we now spend on healthcare transfers, money for bankers and bondholders instead of doctors and nurses. And who will pay for all of that interest? Well, of course, taxpayers. There's no free money out there, and those bondholders on Bay Street and Wall Street don't lend us money out of charity. They expect to get back in return more than they lent us in the first place. That's the way it works. Government-run capitalism where people get rich by feeding off the state, feeding off big government at the expense of working class taxpayers. And that is actually an example of a wealth transfer, one that we too often forget about. Those who claim they believe so fervently in social justice have no problem whatsoever taking money from the lady who bags groceries at the corner store to pay interest on the national debt to wealthy multimillionaire bondholders that own the government's debt. It is a direct transfer from the have-nots to the have-yachts. And it is a transfer of wealth with which this government seems to have no problem as they carry out an unprecedented engorgement of spending that will cost working class families, present and yet unborn. That is the reality of the debt, and we know that that debt will metastasize into tax increases if not brought under control in the near future. Now, we've seen the consequences of rising debt right here in the province of Ontario, where Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty, the Prime Minister's two mentors, whose policy agenda was crafted by Gerald Butts, made Ontario the most indebted jurisdiction in all of North America. More debt as a share of GDP than any of the 50 states or 10 provinces. And now the province is faced with a $14 billion deficit and nothing but ugly decisions ahead of it. You'd think that the Prime Minister would learn from the mistakes of his mentors, that they'd sit him down and say, Prime Minister, you know, I know you're trying to follow in our footsteps, but please learn from the errors of our ways. But apparently they haven't. He'll make the same mistakes over and over and over again, as is customary when people don't learn from history. So that debt will mean today's debt will mean tomorrow's taxes if this Prime Minister is re-elected. But I don't need to just talk about tomorrow. I can talk about today. Today is April Fool's Day, and the joke is on taxpayers. They have shown up at gas stations across Ontario and Saskatchewan, and they have seen gas prices rise. And they're up 4 cents just in one day. But don't be fooled just because it's April 1st. That's only the beginning. The Prime Minister admits, this is in their published documents, that the tax will more than double from $20 today to $50 per ton of carbon in 3 years. Now, he will not tell us how much that tax actually costs people. Well, sure, they put out public relations documents claiming that the full implementation of the carbon tax will only cost a family of two in Ontario about $600. But that assumes they're telling the truth. The carbon taxes are notoriously insidious because all of the costs are embedded in literally millions of products. Anything that is made with or transported by energy becomes more expensive. Sometimes that expense can compound because a single product, like, for example, a plastic pipe, for example, will have petroleum products in it. Well, the carbon tax will make the raw material more expensive. Then heating the factory becomes more expensive. Then operating the machinery to run the systems becomes more expensive. And then in most provinces where we use gas or coal to electrify our economy, electricity becomes more expensive. Then when the product is finally manufactured, it has to be transported to a store, and that transportation is more expensive. So you see, through one product, you're compounding the tax over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until it finally reaches the storefront where the consumer buys it, and they pay HST not just on the product, but on all of the carbon tax pricing embedded in the product. A tax on a tax. And the Prime Minister admits in his own documents, which claim an Ontario family will pay just $600 in carbon taxes, that $600 does not include the HST on the tax on the tax. So right there we have an admission that this is a lot more expensive as a scheme than he has thus far admitted. And furthermore, even if you take out HST, can we really believe that it will cost just $600 in Ontario or $1,000 in Saskatchewan? Well, the answer is no, because I have filed something called access to information requests to get all of the documents which point to the costs of the carbon tax, and to get those documents so I could publish them for the Canadian people. Well, there's good news and bad news. Good news, I got the documents. Bad news, all the numbers are blacked out. In other words, you can find out that it costs money, you just can't find out how much. And so Canadians are expected to just take the Prime Minister at his word when he gives us the quote that the carbon tax will cost just $600 in Ontario. If he's right, then why wouldn't he release all the source documents? You just put them out there and let the chips fall where they may. If I'm wrong, and in fact the carbon tax doesn't cost a penny more than $600 in Ontario and $1,000 in Saskatchewan, well, just put the unredacted documents out and let everybody analyze them for accuracy. But the excuse the government is giving is that the numbers represent advice by public servants to ministers, which is always confidential. Well, I'm not looking for the advice. I'm looking for the numbers. Okay, there's a difference between dollar value and advice. Now, the public servants might have recommended one particular model of carbon tax. That would be advice. And I would be fine with that being blacked out, because that's what the Act says. But that's not what's blacked out. What's blacked out is the cost to Canadian families of the carbon tax. If you want to know the difference between dollar value and advice, take a trip to a restaurant. When you talk to the waiter, you say, "What do you recommend?" Now, his recommendation would be advice. But the price on the menu would not be advice. Now, the price might lead to a recommendation, but it is not itself a recommendation. And therefore, the government's legal justification for blacking out these numbers is false. That's why the Information Commissioner is investigating Finance Canada and Environment Canada, because the preliminary finding of that commissioner is that, in fact, no. The information is not to be redacted, it is to be made public. But we continue to wait and wait and wait, presumably until after the election, to find out the true cost of the carbon tax. Because the government is confusing two different concepts: advice versus price. Canadians want to know the price of the carbon tax. How can we do a cost-benefit analysis if we don't know the cost? It is half of the equation. You know, it is the difference between these two different things is profoundly at the heart of my complaint to the Information Commissioner, and I believe that ultimately, if the government does not relent, eventually the Information Commissioner might have to take this government to court and demand the full and final disclosure of this material. We don't have to take it that far. Let's not spend money on lawyers. Let's not go before court. Let's not have this government found covering up something else. Remember, the reason they're in so much trouble right now is because of a cover-up. They don't need to extend scandal cover-up to a carbon tax cover-up. Just give us the numbers and then let Canadians decide if this tax and this government are worth the price. So I hear a member across the way asking if that's it. Just end the cover-ups, and it will be it. The member across the way for Kingston can have relief and the islands, the beautiful islands. And I wouldn't.
Ryan, the member for order. I do want to